my colleague Cecilia Rios Aguilar and I are really grateful for this funding opportunity and to also be able to explore the lives of students, as we've learned so much from these students and they've motivated us to really think about how to move organizations and bureaucracies forward in community colleges to better serve student parents. So why student parents? Like, why is this important? And right now, a little under a quarter of all undergraduate students have a child or multiple children. This is really important as we think about like who's going to college, what are we doing to support them in higher education, but also it's not noted in this slide, but student parents tend to have higher GPAs than childless children or childless students. So they perform academically well, but when we start looking at persistence and graduation rates, for one cohort of student parents, only 32% graduated in a 6-year period. And most often they're earning certificates and associate's degrees versus bachelor's degrees. And for childless students or childless college students in that same cohort, their graduation rate was closer to 60%. And some of the context and the challenges for student parents is time. In a recent study that came out, student parents have on average about 10 hours a day to study, to care for their children, to sleep, their leisure activities, pick and drop off their kids from school, versus 21 hours for childless students or childless college students. So this also puts a strain on students when we start thinking about the resources that they do or don't have. As most student parents, I think over 32% of student parents are first generation and low income. So that adds additional barriers and challenges for their experiences in higher ed because they don't have the flexibility or the resources to outsource some of the needs or support systems that they need in order to focus on their studies and their daily activities. And as I was thinking about that, like especially the time restraint, like I remember when my own kids were under 4 years old, and just try and get from my house to the car, sometimes it was like 15 minutes because it's like you got to get all their stuff, their strollers, their food, and then as soon as you get them in their car seat, they need a snack or they went to the bathroom, and then it's like there's another 5 minutes before you can even get your kid in the car. So it's not just because student parents are like, having kids is extra tough, but then having kids and being low income and trying to balance all of your life expectations and work just makes it even more complicated. And for us, we looked at one community college that had 2 campuses. And why focus on community college? Because 42% of student parents are enrolled in community colleges across the US. So over the last year, there's been a huge focus on, or over the last 2 years, there's been a huge focus on student parents in higher ed as we've been thinking about who goes to higher ed, how do we help them be successful. So now we're starting to have real data, because in the past, when you go to a community college or even a 4-year and you say, how many of your students have kids? A lot of administrators in enrollment management and VPs of student affairs, they don't know. And they often rely on FAFSA data to see who claims a dependent. But that's not the most accurate number, because some students claim a parent or another loved one that they have to care for that rely on their financial income, but it's not the same expectations, or maybe even a younger brother or sibling based on the context, but it's not the same expectations as having a child that you're responsible for 24 hours a day. So the US government, the Aspen Institute, and so now some community colleges are really taking steps forward to figure out how do we better support and how do we address the needs for student parents, what are some of their biggest challenges, and are student parents taking advantage of the various federal programs to help them focus on their studies. And what we're finding out is that a lot of community colleges and 4-year universities aren't even aware that there are federal programs to help and better support student parents in higher education. And here's one example of what Sacramento State University is doing. Through their student government organization, they're providing like study breaks or study hours for parents to drop off their kids so they can get support, or so they can have dinner, so their kids can do activities, so parents can focus on their studies. And if you notice in the times, it's between 6 and 9 p.m. and then on Saturdays, they're offering like an all-day session. And this really gives parents that time to catch up, to focus on their studies, because sometimes all you need is one focused hour to be able to catch up on everything, or those 2 or 3 focused hours to really catch up on your studies and what you need to do. But again, these are just Band-Aids and short fixes versus institutional changes. And I think that's what we're hoping to do with the study that we're doing with our community college partner. So the research questions that we're moving our study forward is looking at, like, what are the experiences of student parents on campus? What are the factors that, like, inform and motivate them to go back to higher ed? Because a number of the students that we interviewed took long breaks, anywhere from 3, 5, or 7 years between high school graduation and returning to higher education. For a lot of them, it was either a financial reason that they took a break from school, or they didn't have support or childcare support through a trusted loved one. Or in California, where we did this study, the average cost for a licensed childcare center was over $1,100 a month. So for some student parents, that's basically their entire check or half of their monthly income to go towards childcare. And then we also asked, like, what institutional resources, if any, are they using to learn about their workforce or career transitions. So the theoretical framework we were looking or using was career capital and community cultural wealth to really see how students are using their support systems, how they're shaping and framing their aspirations to think about higher ed, and how they're navigating these different spaces to get the information that they need in order to move forward with their focus or their academic focus. So Coastal Community College is an HSI that serves over 23,000 students. 56% of those students are female. They do have an on-campus childcare center that provides childcare from 7 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. For the students that we interviewed, we reached out to over 145 students that were connected to 2 of their programs, either through their childcare center, the Child Development Center, the CDC, or through their CARE program, which is a partnership with the local community to offer counseling and resources for student parents. So we reached out to these 145. 74 said they would show up. 58 participated in either individual or focus group interviews. We were very mindful of incentives. So we provided $20 for focus group interviews or $30 for individual interviews. And we're also flexible in doing telephone interviews for the individual interviews, because we know they're crunched for time, so making them come to campus for an extra hour just didn't make any sense. So we conducted, I think, over 35 individual telephone interviews with students. And in some of the instances, you could hear their kids running around in the background, which, just really just kind of highlighted, like, why we're doing this work, but also the balancing act that these parents are doing on a regular basis. We also, 2 weeks ago, we launched our survey, which we revised like 4 times based on our qualitative findings. Thus far, up until Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, 38 students have responded. I think that's gone up to almost 50 since then, but most of our respondents are female, which also mirrors our qualitative data, which I want to say there was only 2 or 3 men that participated in the study, or student fathers in the study, which was really interesting for us because we were pushing, and like our community college partners, I was like, so y'all don't have any men like participating in like any of the resources? Like, and especially one of the resources is like the Welfare to Work program, which we believe intuitively we're thinking it's also a gendered thing where men don't want to go on welfare or take on that social stigma of like seeking social services or support because of, maybe it's a gendered piece or a masculinity piece, and that's something that we need to tease out more. Because the student fathers we did interview, 2 of them were veterans. So they got a whole another layer of support from veteran services, which required them they didn't feel the need to go to other services because they were getting so much attention from the Veteran Affairs. Let's see. On the surveys, you see we have 22 of the respondents are Latinas or Latinos. 5 are African American. There were 7 biracial students, and API students. Of the 27 that are employed, 10 work more than 20 hours a week. There was a few, I think it's about 5 or 6 are working 35 and plus hours a week. Something was strange was that almost 20 of our respondents said that they work in other industries, but we listed like 35 industries, and we're like, well, what industries are those that they're working in? So that's something we need to follow up with. 4 of the student parents are divorced or separated, and others are married or partnered. Something that we were surprised about was that almost 1 in 5 of the students in our study do not use any resources on campus. So they're not going to the EOP&S program, which is primarily for first-gen low-income students that are like a part of a cohort model where they get like book waivers and preferred registration for their classes. The CalWorks is that welfare-style program, which we're really surprised, like overall, we were just really surprised that so many students weren't using these resources. But you'll see in a few minutes on like what we started picking up and like why that is problematic that student parents aren't using all these various resources. So again, on the qualitative, like how we're making sense of this, we're really just trying to highlight the students' experiences, trying to understand the complicated decision making that they're doing, how they're getting support for workforce opportunities, who they're going to, and we're really centering this work from an asset-based perspective and thinking about what they have to offer, what they're experiencing, and how they're resilient in so many ways. We were fortunate enough to have a number of graduate students helping us with this work from UCLA and USC that helped us with the coding and the interviews, which made it a lot easier for us to try to figure out and coordinate us trying to reach out to these 150 plus student parents. So it was nice that we were able to like ask some of the undergrads to do cold calls to try to motivate them to the student parents to participate. As we're using Deduce to code all of our data, and you'll see like through our word cloud, like what were the things that were jumping out the most was balancing responsibilities, the student recommendations. My personal favorite is the good quotes on sometimes students say something that's just so powerful that you just have to capture that. And just a lot of the institutional policies and practices and who they're getting support and like where the challenges are for them as they get to campus. Here are their majors or concentration areas for the students. Most of them are interested in nursing, either their RN program or the LVN program. There's a good number of them in STEM and social sciences like psychology, sociology. There's a number of students that are interested in drug and alcohol rehab as well. And that's a certificate program in California where you could go on and become like a licensed counselor / therapist with that certification in a number of hours. So when we started asking students about their experiences on campus, some of the challenges were just trying to figure out who to go to. So as this student highlights is like, this campus offers like emergency resources or supports, but then they have to go to multiple offices to get that help. And that was one of the biggest challenges, as I talked about earlier with time poverty, is if you're spending 2 hours just walking around campus trying to figure out who has the right form or who has the right information, then it's really deflating because at the end of the day, you don't get the resource and then you just leave frustrated or angry at the institution. And a number of students experience that where they go to the counseling center and they have one question and then they have to go to the financial aid office, and then they have to go to this office, and then they have to go to another office just to find the right answer. Another student's like, one of the biggest complaints is like when you go to the counseling office, like they should have these answers. But again, like you have to bounce around trying to figure that out. And as the student says, like you don't have that time to kill. Where a lot of like childless students, they have that flexibility in that time if they do want to, if they have to stand in line for 45 minutes of financial aid to get something resolved, they can do that. Additionally, other students talked about like, and it's not just all negative, right? Because like it'd be really easy for us just to highlight the 45 statements or quotes from student parents that are saying like, this is how messed up this place is, this is what's so wrong. Most of the students that did highlight positive experiences were with the counseling staff on the campus. So because for some of the parents that are involved in CARE or CalWorks or the EOPS program, It's more of a structured opportunity to have required touches with the counselors, so they develop stronger relationships most of the time. So one student talks about how the counselor was really pushing her to see herself as supermom, that she would be able to do the things that she wants to do, that she'll be able to manage and focus on being successful in community college. And that really just motivated the student and really built up their aspirations of what is possible for them and their family. Another student talked about how supportive another counselor was and was always providing contingency plans for them just in case things don't work out or they bottom out in the academic programs. Especially for students who are interested in nursing, the number of science classes that they have to take can be really frustrating just for any student, but then additionally for student parents who are trying to manage a lot more challenges. And then we started looking and questioning, like, what's motivating these students to come back to school? And like, why are they trying to do this? And for a lot of the student parents, it was about trying, not just proving it to themselves, but also as a motivation for their children of having, like, I can do it, I want to give my kids a better life. And we saw that throughout all the interviews is like, I want my son or daughter to see me walk across that stage to, like, that's when people really started crying, when they started talking about like that final goal and recognizing all of the, all the struggles that they go through in order to get to that point, to visualize like, all right, when I graduate, this is how I see it's going to happen. And like others were like the motivational part, like, provide for my kids, but also recognizing the economics of it, because if you don't have a college education, then you're looking at $10 or $11 or $12 an hour minimum. Well, now minimum wage is $15 in California, but still $15 an hour in LA County isn't really a lot of money. So student parents are like, I need to make money, or I need to get this degree so I can have a better income, so I can provide for my children in a much better and enhanced way. So you'll see right here, like, so we asked student parents, like, all right, like, your motivations to be in college, most of them were saying their children, and they want a better life. And something that we didn't anticipate when we started these interviews was the number of students that were recently divorced, that were exiting or recently became single parents because they left abusive relationships. There was a lot of trauma. We've heard about sexual assaults. We heard about depression, anxiety. And for us, we weren't anticipating hearing that. We really thought like it was going to be just like, what brought you into college? Like, just like much more surface level, but the depth of like what they had experienced and the trauma that they had experienced over the last, we'll just say 3 to 5 years, was so intense that we're like, okay, well, what do we need to do differently, and how do we make sure to refer out to different people on campus to be able to better support them? Because once you open that up and like people start crying and get really emotional, it's like we can't just say, well, thanks for the interview, here's your $20, see you later. Like we had that sense of responsibility to reach out to the VP of Student Affairs and say, how do we better support the student parent? Is there someone on campus that they can talk to? And we were trying to be very thoughtful about reaching out to those people. Something else we also thought about too is like, how do they do it, right? As like, so in the other study on time poverty, then we're like, well, how many hours are our student parents sleeping? And as you see, most of them are getting 5 to 6 hours a night of sleep. Some are getting less than 4 hours. There's, one person that gets 8 to 10 hours. I'm not sure how they do it, but that's just kind of what they do. And we also thought it was really important to ask, like, when do they study? And like, when are they able to make that happen? And as you'll see, the biggest response was whenever I have free time. Because having a child, like, you just never know when he or she is gonna get sick, and then you just kind of have to change all your plans to focus on their needs. So a lot of the student parents talked about also studying after 8 o'clock, after they put their kids to bed, after they do showers and homework and dinner and clean up, and then they go from 8 o'clock at night till 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, just to get started back again at like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning with their kids. So one of the things that we were really interested in was like, who are they getting information from for their future careers, or thinking about like internships, or thinking about like, what are you going to do after you get this degree or certificate? And if you notice, like, very few students are going to the Career Center or the Transfer Center. And that's something we also picked up in the interviews when we started asking students, do you go to the Career Center for advice? And most of us looked at us really puzzled, like, what's that? Like, what do they do there that I won't get from a counselor? So we really had to do, after the interviews, like we were like, well, the Career Center does these things. They help you in these ways. The Transfer Center is going to help you like this, to think about this. And a lot of the students were really confused about that being a separate entity to provide like additional individual support to help them think through like what's next and how to plan for the future. Because some of the students are required to do like internship hours for their programs of study. All right, so, in wrapping up, so like now what? So one of the big pieces was like, all right, us doing this work, but we're really lucky that we have that we're partnering with the VP of Student Affairs that we have, because he was eager to get the preliminary report and have a conversation with us last month, because he's anticipating building in a lot of our recommendations into his next fiscal year budget. So then that way he can start seeing how he can better improve the experiences of student parents. And then on another level, the new board chair for their board of trustees, that person's main interest is better supporting student parents. So we have the board of trustees, the VP of student affairs, and then the research that we're doing, it like actually all aligned. So then that way it's not just us providing recommendations that aren't going to go anywhere. It's actually things that we're hoping to see institutional change in the next academic year. Because in that way, with the VP saying, all right, I'm ready and willing to allocate this much money towards the needs of student parents, then like that's, I think what any researcher wants to see is like actual institutional change. So we're really excited about that. So now we're exploring like how do we like extend childcare hours for student parents, because as I mentioned earlier, their child development center only provides hours between Monday to Friday, 7 to 6. But they have classes that go until 10 o'clock at night, and they have weekend classes on Saturdays from 8 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. So now he is trying to figure out a different way to support the student parents with those resources. Also, we're thinking, we've provided recommendations about offering workshops to student parents about not just like stress management and time management, because these student parents are great at already managing their time because of their daily responsibilities, but maybe more focusing on how to build better relationships with your kids, especially for the individuals that have dealt with so much trauma and stress and anxiety or abuse, as some of their kids might have witnessed those experiences. So we're trying to provide those spaces of support. So our recommendations for the college was like, how do you identify first student parents? So now he's working with his enrollment management and financial aid to figure out a better way to figure out how many student parents they actually have in their institution. They're exploring ways to bundle resources or services, so in that way student parents don't have to go from office to office to office. We're hoping he'll go with a single stop model. They do need to revise policies because in some of the spaces, there are signs that say no children allowed or no children welcome. So they're trying to figure out how to revise those policies. So he's working with the president and facilities and other entities on campus to figure out how to make this more of an inclusive and supportive campus. And now they're trying to make sure to secure those funds. So, and with that, thank you so much.
I would be curious if you could talk a little bit more about your experience when you were interviewing these students and they were sharing all these emotional stories, and how do you navigate your interview techniques or your script when you face something like that?
When it was like a focus group interview and like people started crying, after the first time people cried, we're like, oh, we got to bring tissues, we got to bring all this extra stuff. And then like we would just like kind of not stop the interview, but like pause our recorders and just kind of like just take a moment to like let people like breathe and just kind of like let out that stuff. And it was actually pretty unique because when some students started crying, like the other participants started crying as well, because like I think there was that shared empathy of like, I've been through that too, I know what you're going through. And especially in moments of like domestic violence or sexual assault, like there was just like, I guess like that cohesion between everyone in that room of like, like it's okay that we're like slowing down the interview, like we're pausing, if we had to take a 5-minute break just to make sure people were in a good place, like that was fine. But we also like checked in to be like, if you don't want to continue, like you totally have that right to like, we can stop, we can follow up with a telephone interview. Like we provided additional options so the student didn't feel pressured to continue. Because sometimes researchers will push through and just kind of ignore people's like emotional well-being just to get the data. And that's something that we stress to the students who are like, if this is happening, just kind of like take a step back, or the graduate students, like take a step back and just kind of like assess and then figure out how to better support that student's needs. And if we have to reschedule, that's just what we'll do.
What's the age of most parents' children, and did you notice any differences among parents with different age children?
Most of the parents that we interviewed, I think their kids were under the age of 5. And then for the survey data, I didn't include that for the average age of their kid. That was really interesting because like some of the parents that had their kids involved in the Child Development Center, that's something, a fact that I didn't share, is that most of the wait time to get your child into the Child Development Center was anywhere from 7 to 8 months to 14 months. So just to be able to get your kid into childcare, like that was a big issue. But then if you had older kids that were like 8 or 9 years old, they don't qualify for that space anymore, because most of the schools in that community provide like after-hour care or like additional resources. But that also put like a pressure on parents, because it's like, if the after-school care ends at like 5 and your class goes till 6, like how do you manage that time? So that's something that we're trying to refine in our instruments, is to capture the number of kids, the genders of kids, and the ages of kids. Because when we're doing interviews, like, we're like, well, how many kids do you have? And they're like, 2. We're like, okay, thanks. And then we just like move forward. But we're like, after the first couple of rounds, we're like, oh, we need to go back and ask them the ages of their kids, because the support services for a 13-year-old is going to be very different versus a 7-year-old. And with what a lot of the student parents like commented about summer, that if they didn't have like a summer program or a reduced cost summer program, like they couldn't take summer classes because either their partner was working or they felt the need to work full time in order to like save as much as they could for the next academic year. So that was another tension that student parents experienced as well.
I'm trying to think about, when you describe the challenges these students confront, what parts of these challenges are really related to them being parents, and what part are experienced by other students at the college? Can you speak at all to that? Did you talk to any students who weren't parents, or do you have a sense of what's happening with them?
No, we know in community colleges the average age is like 28 of students, so people are working full time, going to class at night. But with these student parents, I think that the extra thing was the unpredictableness of if your kid's sick or not sick, or if childcare falls through. Because a lot of the student parents they didn't have their kids in traditional like childcare settings, so they were relying on like a mom or an aunt or someone else to provide those services. And when people stopped, said that I have other plans, then you have to scramble very differently than someone that doesn't have a kid, that is only responsible for themselves and maybe, like a partner. But when you're responsible for your kid and your kid's 3 and childcare like bails on you, then you have to scramble very differently than someone that doesn't have those kids. But I think there is a lot of similarities of the pressures to work, like finding classes, but then also like when, just say for example, some faculty members had policies of no kids in class, and if your childcare again falls through at night, then you're in that balance of like, do I tell my professor again that I don't have childcare, or do they think it's an excuse or a reality? And some of the parents were thoughtful about not self-disclosing their status as student parents, because they didn't know how some faculty would respond to their needs.
So I'll push a little more on that, because I get what you're saying, but it seems likely that some of the experiences of trauma, sexual abuse, some of the other conflicts related to income and resources that these parents face are probably also faced by non-parents. And I'm just trying to still get a sense of the degree to which the experience of parents in this setting is different from that of non-parents. For example, you suggested that non-parents have plenty of flexible time to wait in these lines for long periods or walk around campus and do stuff. But I didn't hear you talk about talking to non-parents and sort of an empirical basis for how they've got lots and lots of time to kill.
And I think that's, I would say that would probably be a limitation of our study, is that we didn't interview childless students or, other populations to see like what their experiences were on like how they navigate or get services. But I think if anything, like for the student parents that were veterans, like their ease of being able to access resources were very different than the student parents, because in the veterans, like you have a veteran counselor, a veteran center, so the lines might be a lot shorter to get those resources versus just regular, like general, like college counseling, where you could have 50 people or 10 people in that line and it's not like appointments. So I think that, that's definitely gonna be a limitation of our work, that we don't know the type of like social emotional experiences or academic experiences for non-parents.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your culture community wealth framework, and in what cases or instances that certain types of capital matter more for this population.
So we're talking about navigational capital, social capital, and then aspirational capital. And I think like when looking at like just even the reasons and motivations to go back to higher ed, like I think that's where we see like aspirational capital for just trying to have like that stability, trying to like have like self-empowerment was like a big piece that students talked about. Just like being able to like rely and move forward and think about their like, their family and the next steps. And then just trying to understand and navigate the bureaucracies of what's happening, like that's intuitively like navigational capital and thinking about Yoso's work. But then also trying to figure out who are the support systems on campus. And that's something that in one of the programs, I do believe it was CARE, that they offered, at one point they were offering like parent circles or parent resource groups where parents would like exchange clothes, they would exchange like resources and tips. And that's something that the VP SA is trying to bring back again, is to try to figure out how to like do low cost like support systems for student parents.
Wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the experiences of single parents versus those who have spouses. Were there any differences in terms of topics they discussed or potential challenges or opportunities they faced?
The students that were partnered, like either married or like were, that were partnered, I think a lot of them talked about their partner or their husbands or wives, their husbands were able to provide a lot more financial stability for them, so they didn't have the same financial stresses that the single parents had. Because the number of single parents like that weren't working, that were relying on social services, like that's, and they were living like in Section 8, like those are experiences that were very different than the married couples, because a lot of the married couples or the married parents were like, yeah, my husband is saying just focus on my studies, get this done, and then when I'm done, he's gonna come back to school. So, and there was like transitional like challenges for them because they had gone from working full-time to just being a full-time student. So that like it was really just trying to adjust to the income differences of being able to like have more flexibility to spend resources on your kids or not. So I think, and I definitely think that needs more analysis from us to figure out like how to move that forward and tease that out a little bit more.
Were all these classes attended on site, on campus, or were there any online classes available to these students?
I want to say there was at least 5 or 6 students who were just strictly enrolled online for all their classes. And that's how they navigated higher ed, just because it was a lot easier for them. But we also had students that didn't have internet or computers at home. They were using public library for technology. So those are some of the challenges of just trying to access and like do your assignments. But then when you're doing your online classes, some of the challenges were like you didn't know who on campus could provide additional support or resources. And I specifically remember that one student that was doing everything online, and when I was asking her questions about like, the career center, or the transfer center, or this service or that service, she was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I think there was that disconnect between like trying to figure out how to navigate the school versus, like there's, doing school versus like being involved in each of the different facets of like the support systems are going to be very different. And I think that was another challenge too, because as I pointed out, like, it's almost 20% of our students aren't using any resources on campus. So there was a number of students that talked about missteps of like, I took all these classes, but now I've changed majors. You know, I realized I can do this other thing, and now I have to redo everything. So it's going to take me an extra 2 years to do this course of study. So as a lot of the literature already says, like when students have access to academic advising that is like forward thinking to say, this is what you're going to do next year or next semester, they're more likely to persist and they're more likely to reach graduation. But if you're disconnected because of, you know, like distance ed or online education, then it kind of puts you in a tougher place to move forward as quickly.
You know, this provides a really useful description of, you know, some students' experiences that could set up some hypotheses about like what are the types of interventions that would, you know, really help these particular students that you could test, you know.
Oh, yeah.
And if, you know, if you wanted to make an argument to policymakers. So what are a couple of the and you provided some you know, some suggestions or recommendations, but like what's one that sort of like could set up that you would want to test, that you have a question about, like if we did this differently,
Oh yeah.
could really do something.
And that's in our proposal to the Gates Foundation that we're submitting this week.
Great.
So, but yeah, definitely we could talk about that after.
Do you ever think of interviewing these students after they have graduated to sort of find out like where they end up, like do they find a job or how their situations have changed or what they would have done differently when they were in college?
So I think in the future, if we can get additional resources, I think that would be great. And especially if we can work with our, like the VP of Student Affairs, like if we can figure that out, or one of the resource centers on campus that supports student parents, like if they potentially have a list of past graduates, I think that would be a great follow-up for us to understand like what was the person or the program or the thing that like got them through. And especially, did it get them through quickly, or were they there for 6 years or 5 years in community college? And if they were there for 5 years, like what were the things, you know, maybe if they can remember semester to semester, that were the hiccups that caused them to, you know, stop out or drop units, or, you know, like what was the thing? So that would be an interesting follow-up. Thank you.
It does appear that Coastal City College has the resources or the institutional resources to be able to allocate like money to the solutions that you guys proposed. How do you think that might be different for a community college that might not have those resources? So in other words, if it was a community college who didn't have money to develop, you know, institutional techniques to identify students who are parents, who are not parents, and maybe didn't have a well-developed child development center, how do you think those solutions will be different for those colleges as opposed to a college like Coastal City College?
So like maybe a low-cost intervention to identify student parents is like, maybe, you know, every semester when you enroll in classes and you do it online, it could be like a pop-up question, like, are you a parent, right? And it's like, yes, I am a parent. And then it's like, well, how many kids do you have? Like, it could be a very like simple thing when they do registration, or they could change their, because this school is within its own community college district in California, so they have more flexibility to work with not just their university administration, but also their board of trustees to try to like tweak things as they want, right? Because in just say like LA community college system or district, you know, it's a very different system where you have like 20 schools reporting to one board of trustees that might be, the politics might be very different. So, and then how other schools could potentially respond? Well, something that we pointed out too is that a lot of the students aren't taking advantage of federal programs that they're entitled to, because maybe the director of financial aid or the VP of student affairs isn't aware of all these federal efforts that their students could be tapping into to get those resources so they can focus on, you know, their studies. So I think it's about trying to find internal and external resources to better support your students, because, you know, if we have the same students taking, or, you know, if we have experience like dropout every semester of like, you know, like, and we know at what point they drop out, it's like, what can the college do differently to like step in and to intervene? And, you know, like I think there's been a big push on like basic needs and also like, you know, emergency aid. So how do we like step in and like provide those things if it's, you know, a $500 in like support for that student that needs it in order to stay in school? Because, you know, maybe they're short on rent, or there's a childcare expense, or like something to keep those students in school. And financial aid directors have a lot of discretion in how they use their aid, and are they being mindful in how they support student parents? Because something that we thought about too is like there's a big difference between empathy and like sympathy, right? And a lot of the individuals that we've interacted with, or a lot of the students that we talked about empathetic counselors versus like counselors that pitied them. So like that's something that we're also thinking about in our work, is like, again, focusing on the asset-based part, on the agency part. Like, how do we make sure that we're supporting these students so they empower themselves, versus like us pitting them and saying like, this is what they need because we got to fix them because they're broken.
When you were talking about like some of the solutions, I started thinking about, I'm a community college product myself from LA, and I know that institutional culture has a lot to do in terms of supporting students. So I'm thinking like, okay, you could throw money at a problem and try to develop these things, but if the institutional culture is not there to be able to develop this, some of these solutions, then it's kind of like a Band-Aid, right? That's why kind of like what you're saying right now kind of gets me thinking of, well, do individuals don't know about these additional resources because supporting these students is not a priority to them, which obviously kind of reflects on part of the institutional culture? Or is it just because, well, there's so many resources out there that it's kind of impossible to know every single one of them, right? So it's kind of like trying to understand how the individual, in this case, the student that's a parent, could successfully navigate the institution that maybe does not have the culture that's able to support them efficiently through their whole process.
We're lucky right now that things are lining up because we have a vice president of student affairs that's committed to this, the board of trustees that's committed to this. So in the next few weeks, when we write our report to the community college, like that VP is going to like integrate a lot of our recommendations into his budget. So he has that discretion to say like, I want to allocate 3 or 5 or whatever % of his budget towards student parents' needs. But it's also a challenge too, because when we sat down with him and his team, we're like, well, how many student parents do you have? And they all looked at each other like, well, we don't know. So like, how do you address and like, design more interventions and services for when you don't even know if it's 500 student parents, like 2,000 student parents, like 5,000, like how do you create something that's equitable and that's going to have a big institutional change when you don't even know the total number of students that you're trying to serve? So, and I think in other community colleges, like, well, on the student affairs side, we have buy-in. Now, whether we have buy-in on the academic affairs, like that's another question of like, and I think that's something we'll see throughout the rest of the academic year is, will the VP and president invite us to like, go and talk to the academic senate or to the faculty, or like what type of, next steps are we going to work with their faculty to bring attention to this? So I guess, like we have the benefit of being associated to like SC and UCLA. So if we come in and saying like, please like at least hear us out on our recommendations and what we've seen, because we need faculty to be partners on this versus fighting us on, basic recommendations.
What works? Like,
Yeah.
what do we know about what really helps parents that's tied to outcomes like graduation
Yeah.
and different things like that?
And I think at the end of our survey and at the end of our like interviews, we asked students like what recommendations they would have. And that's something that we haven't fully mined yet. And we have a lot of responses and suggestions, and they fall into the category of like low cost versus high cost. Some students think everything's great because they're connected to all these different services, so their experience is a lot smoother than students that aren't connected to anything.
But like, is there literature that
From I know I've read a bunch of stuff about this, yeah. So I'm just trying, but it's a lot of the same things. Like get students connected to like these programs, like lessen the barriers to these resources. Make sure students like feel like owners of over their academic experience. So it's like, it's more like we haven't, I don't think as a learning community, we figured out like what are the best things that are going to help student parents be successful so we can see those positive outcomes. I think that's something still to be tested.